it's really two parts. One that's like more towards what we were talking about with the theming, and then one that's very specific.
Okay, so Aiden, why don't you shoot for going after Mike?
Okay.
Does that work? Cool. All right, go for it, man.
Okay. Just real quick to dovetail off of what we were talking about with the styling. Cassandra started a repo that was outlining all of the shared variables that we could have using the -- theme prefix. Did you talk about that last week, Cassandra? I missed it.
I didn't. I would love to talk about that this week if there's time.
Yeah, I think that would be the most beneficial thing that we could cover.
That is now the thing we're doing. Boom.
Yeah. Is that what repo is that located at?
It is in my, let's see, let me find the link here. My projects. Okay. And it is WC theming standards. So here it is. I will paste it here for you.
All right.
All the good stuff's in the wiki.
Oh, gotcha.
And the issue queue, which has stuff for discussion, but the wiki shows kind of the outline.
Okay. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but I'm wondering if maybe you would you want to drive for a second to
Yeah, do you want me to
this?
pick up screen share? I didn't want to take over.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. Now I'm a co-host.
Yeah.
Oh, so fancy.
You should be able to share now.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Cool beans. I'll skip right into the good stuff because I like code. So these are some of the proposed variables. I have a story in a future sprint. I'm not sure, it's not assigned yet, but a story that I'm working to get into a sprint where I'm going to collaborate with there's the Patternfly project and then the web components facet of it. I want us to get together and kind of standardize around these general variables instead of using, right now we have namespaced variables. But these kind of break it down into a couple of different sections. So you have UI variables, which are things like buttons, toggles, little tiny things that appear, little icons, like things that appear on your screen in your UI. And then you have surface variables, which are cards, bands, accordions, tab sets, large swaths of space that usually have more text based on them. So there's those variables around that, and they're pretty similar. You'll notice like there's link values, colors, different variants for colors. Like we kind of went with some super generic naming. I've seen a lot in Patternfly and in the Hacks project using like numbers, like accent 1, accent 2, accent 3, and that's a good approach. We've tried to keep it really minimal and just do base, complement, accent, and disabled. And in Surface, you'll see the addition of lightest, lighter, and darker, darkest. That's because they're CSS variables, so you can always override what the value is, So in a context where I want to kind of change the accent color to be a little bit darker, you would just update what the value of that variable is for accent. So accent would then have a new meaning, but that list of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for different shades would live in your system as maybe SAS variables or some other format. It would just live in your system. So this is super minimal, super open-ended theming that could kind of cascade. And you can also go crazy with your variable nesting. So if you wanted to assign this theme variable to some internal variable that you have, you can do that too with a fallback. And then border settings with different properties for border. And the bullet points usually outline variants or subsets. And I think I have an example. So this is just all of the suggested variables in descriptive terms, but I'm thinking, do I have an example of just like some output? I don't. Yeah, they kind of end up looking like this, like using the BEM naming, dash dash, general, dash dash font family, heading font family. I think I'll add that next for proposed variables. I just want to just do like a big like data dump of like what would this look like spelled out in usually we assign ours to root. You could do it contextually too for your theme. You could apply your theme to like a section of your site. You don't have to apply the theme everywhere. And then the idea behind this, the whole driver behind this, is that these variables would be universal. So if I throw a polymer, if I throw a hex component, if I throw a patternfly component on my page, they should all have a similar look and feel, similar colors, similar UI, unless it's relevant to the component that it not change. So the component developer needs to make the decision about where to put these variables. So I would say, you know, oh, I don't want you to customize the border radius because it's really important to the fidelity of this component that the border radius not change. So then we don't surface that as the theme variable. We wouldn't use that hook. That would be hard-coded. But maybe you want to allow for color customization. Then you would use the theme variables so that you can allow people to hook in with fallbacks built into your system so that it kind of has, your fallbacks are your system's look and feel, like how you would want to use. So think material design. They've got a very set like color palette and everything. And so those would be their fallbacks. And so if you just throw it on your page with no theme, you just get a material design component. Woohoo! But if you're a very opinionated site, these themes would allow you to kind of make them all look and feel the same.
Cool.
What I was going to show was after I saw your discussion at HaxCamp and this proposal, I put together a little repository of what the theming pattern could look like. So it's at this URL here. Just chat.
This is so cool. I didn't know this existed.
Oh, really?
You should have pinged me with this.
I think I did, but I think I was like putting it together as I was pinging you on Twitter.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So the idea is that if we could standardize on all these proposal CSS variables that are prefixed by theme, you could have an example where I have this X card, and this is, by the way, how Chuck has been building his elements, where this looks a little crazy, but it's got a very distinct pattern. So what we do is we're first going to target the part attribute, which if you're unfamiliar with part, CSS parts are being standardized where you can select a part using this selector, and that should filter down and hit all of the parts. So this is a way for you to theoretically pierce Shadow DOM. So if we, instead of targeting CSS selectors and IDs, what if we targeted parts just by default? And then we, pretty much everything we do, we have a CSS variable assigned to a property. So in this case, this top color width, God, I wish that thing wouldn't pop up all over the place. If we're targeting width on our top color part, instead of saying just 100%, what if we defined an actual variable for that property specifically that could be overridden from anywhere? So you as a user could go into the root and alter the width of your card through here. So if I had this set, I can obviously go into the root here and alter it to say 50% instead.
Now, I've noticed that at least in our repo, if you override a CSS variable from a web component at the root, it doesn't cascade. I think the specificity is not quite there. Like it uses the fallback value instead. The only way I've been able to override the value of a CSS variable on a specific component is to actually use like a class on that thing. So like on a card, I'd have to say like custom card and then override the variable. How have you had success using custom properties at the root like this?
So you mean selecting a specific card in this case?
No, I mean generally. So like if I go to my root and I do PFE card -- width 80% or 50% like you did, I've found in the wild that our web components don't pick up that value because of the host specificity. There's some weird thing with like how it's understanding specificity with the host.
Yes. So I think this is where this comes in. So what we have always done before is anytime that we specified a CSS variable, we set it up on our host. We initially defined it. We defined like a fallback on our host. Would you do that?
Yeah, I can after you're done, I can share kind of like what ours looks like, and maybe you can tell me like how tell me where I've gone wrong, because there's some specificity thing that drives me crazy that I can't get.
Yeah, this drove me nuts because by us doing that, we were in a sense introducing the problem that you just described. Which for this specific example wouldn't be an issue. So I'm pretty sure that this, no matter where this element showed up, if I overrode that CSS variable at the root, it would permeate down through all of our web components.
You can see it updating for at least 2 of the bars already.
Right, yeah. Now it is because it's right in the light DOM here. So I could set it up into like another web component that had a shadow DOM.
So that extra nesting might be an issue.
Yeah, so I'll try that. But I'm pretty sure that works. Now, the issue that I had whenever I was trying to implement the theming standard was that the idea of the theming standard is I could set theme accent 1. That's like, or let's just say like theme font color. That is just an agreed upon CSS variable that we all use across all of our projects. So I would be able to override this at the root of my project. And then anytime I'm implementing a web component that's using color at all, I would think to myself, okay, well, knowing that this standardized theme variable exists of font color, how am I gonna use this in my web component? And I would say, okay, well, let's just say that I wanted to implement color on the text part here. So I want this property to now tie in to the theming standard. To do that, and this is like so freaking complicated that hopefully I can articulate this, but basically you define a specific CSS variable for this part, for this exact selector here. So xcard text color, that will target that specific property. And then as a fallback, you say, if nobody's overridden that property yet, I want to use the xcard text color local variable. Now, what the heck is that? So that variable is what ties into the theme color font. That makes it so if that makes all the fallbacks handle correctly. So
I'm
that
having a light bulb moment. This is great. It's
okay.
because your variables are empty. The first
Yes.
variable in the list is empty. So it's always going to look at the fallback unless you have a theme.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, we went that route at first. I think Kendall talked me out of it.
Okay. All right.
I can't speak for her. I don't know why.
Yeah. No, I would love to hear why. Because yeah, this is like a real melon tweaker that I'm still not sure about, but it works. But it is ungodly confusing to reason about just looking at what's going on here. But basically, the premise is that every property gets its own unique CSS variable, and with a fallback. And then if you want to tie it into the theme, what you do is properties that are tied into the theme convention define a CSS variable with this pattern: -- element name -- CSS part name -- CSS property. And what does that? I don't know if that means what I intended it to mean.
No, it's you have X card is element name, and then top color is the part name.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the default for the fallback for it is then this local variable that is tied into the overarching theme variable.
I think that's really good if you're reusing that top value. So like if you're reusing background color default and text color local multiple times in your component, that's going to be really helpful. If you're only using it once, you could probably save yourself a little time, and then just in the part text where you've got like text color local, you could just put the theme value right there. And that would save you one step.
I think for some reason, because that's what you told me on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I tried to do that and it wasn't behaving like I thought it was. It was like something was being overridden that I didn't intend to be overridden. And maybe it was this fallback variable or fallback value. I forget. But yeah, I'll have to revisit it to see if that's still the case.
Is there Cassandra, would there be a reason why we wouldn't maybe have, instead of, Mike, if you scroll over a little, so like you have that ultra specific host selector, Mike, but isn't the whole point of these that these are locally driven overrides for this very specific element? So wouldn't we want Cassandra's theming convention stuff to be applied to the global, but then local you could almost have like local background color default, or are you still trying to keep with the tag name for a reason? Because are you going to set Xcard top color background color default at the top level of your application? Because based on what you said before, that wouldn't even work.
This?
Yeah, so like you wouldn't be able to set that at the root selector and have it apply because host is always going to overtake it, right?
No, that should work.
I love learning how the browser works in this way, Cassandra.
Yeah.
We go back and forth on this crap all the time.
No,
Yeah, I think that's what I tried, is basically what you've got there, and that ended up with a specificity issue.
Okay.
Because see, it's not changing to purple. So this is the issue. Would you mind if
I? Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Because I think I want you to just see what this code looks like real quick. Here we go. So this is a compiled version of the style. We build them all separate, right? So this gets injected into our style tag. This is my host for the card. You can see we define like all of our variables right up top, and here immediately we're mapping them to these theme. These would conceivably become just theme container spacer, for example. And this, if I try to override padding top on every card on the page at root, this cannot beat the host specificity because it picks up calc instead. I can override container spacer at the root because this technically has no value set by the project. It's only for theme. So I think you're right. The key is empty variables. The only way that it works cascading from root down is if you have an empty variable in your component to hook into.
Gotcha.
But I can override padding top if I just add like a class to my card. Or if I just do like PFE card, the name of my web component, and then just override card padding top. I can override it because that is more specific than host.
Exactly. But you can't, it won't cascade through Shadow DOM, that selector.
Yes, it will.
Will it?
Yeah. Yeah, it still cascades.
Yeah.
Trying to think if I think I have a code pen that does this. Customizing a web component. I think this is it. Yeah, so custom styles 1 is a class that's on one of the cards. And that overrides the border property, which if I go back to the code, the border property is being set equal to border weight, border style, border color. So I'm just like ignoring all of those in one swath by overriding that generic property. And then that picks up here, no problem. And that is in the Shadow DOM because we render the card body in the Shadow DOM. Let's see if there's any more. Custom styles 4. This one does it too. Background position, background color. To give us this kind of weird gradient.
What's the rationale for the capital letters?
Oh, that is if you're referencing a CSS property by name. So background position is a CSS property, background dash position. So in BEM, if you're directly pointing to a CSS property, you do uppercase.
Okay, cool, thank you.
You've helped me so much. I'm so excited.
I am more confused, to be honest, but that's good.
Tradesies.
That means I'm going to be watching this video on a loop this week.
Reading through the CSS spec, it says that host acts like any other pseudo selector since it's not a real one, although pseudo selectors kind of have magic powers, relatively speaking.
And don't work in Shadow DOM and Safari. Thanks, Safari.
I'm going to go on record and say Safari is the new Internet Explorer.
Thank you for beating me to that. That's literally what I was about to say.
Seems to be the consensus. Someone needs to sit down the browser developers at Safari and be like, yo, don't do this.
You've read a history book before, and we've been through this. I actually, if I may, I have like a different approach. So I noticed mostly what you guys have that I've seen here is like Greenfield, where you're customizing the components, everything about them from beginning to end, what they essentially look like. My approach is using something like Tailwind CSS, and I want to start from that standpoint because I don't want to mess with colors, theme, style, and layout. I want to use that existing kind of technology. So I can skip a step and then work my way backwards, essentially. So in the way I ended up doing it for now, which was totally a hack, but kind of was solving my problems was step one using lit elements, changing the create render route. So I completely got rid of Shadow DOM. But knowing that's not practical and caused a couple of other problems for me, specifically re-renders of components because of the way I was force injecting the components in, it caused re-renders, and I want to get rid of all that. So backing out of the create render route, but I still want that main style theme that's coming down. So I did this hack. I can simplify these windows here, but
Holy man.
this is essentially a cascading. But ultimately, I just did this trick. So I have my Webpack just building out and exporting out a CSS file. So I just kludged it in here. Now I did this versus what is referenced everywhere is to do kind of one of these static get styles. The problem I had with this one is this one uses the replace sync method of the underlying component. And because I'm using an import, it does not like that. It'll throw. So this is the only way I could kind of inject it manually is to do it this way. So I could actually use the replace function instead of the replace sync, which is what I believe lit element is actually using. And I don't know of a way yet of overriding that. But ultimately, this is sort of I guess, partially the solution I want, but I was wondering, is there a better way to kind of take from an existing CSS, whether or not it'd be Bootstrap or, whatever. So instead of building out every single component manually, how do I start from a state that has already been given and then just work our way up from there? So I don't know if there's a colloquial way of doing that, or is it?
So I actually just did this a couple nights ago with material library, just at material, not the web component. Let me see if I can pull up an example.
Yeah, and from my understanding, obviously the way I hacked that in there is I essentially copied the whole parsing of that entire CSS library into each one of the components, which you don't want to do. In a best case world, only maybe the classes that I'm using in that component would get pulled in. But even then, you still want to share them somehow. So whether or not it's like Brian's first example that he was showing, which having the element that essentially the parent style wrapper, if you will, that you were showing, that is partially the way, and to do it that way, and then that way they can at least inherit one style instead of having to repeat them. But I'm not sure about the piercing, because each one of these components is then nested under like this. How far do I have, where exactly do I have to put it that it doesn't repeat it 12 times versus just one?
So part of the reason I think lit element uses that the sync or async or whatever it is version is because it will fall on constructible style sheets like you're using there with that class, right? And I think it'll kind of garbage collect them all into one, so that you actually only get one copy, even if like hundreds of elements are referencing that same one. That's my understanding of it, at least. And then the styles thing it'll be able to do a fallback for browsers that don't natively support that, the CSS style sheet as a JavaScript object thing.
Yeah, I think I got the same gist from that as well, which is why they don't do the the replace method, because there's essentially artifacts that they can't control in there, because they don't know what kind of imports you might be doing inside of that file.
Yeah, I'm looking for, I know there's some Bootstrap elements that people merge lit element with Twitter Bootstrap. I'm trying to find how they did those. Whoa, there is some weird CSS going on here. I'll paste in the chat. It looks like they're trying to actually rebuild Bootstrap around having custom elements be involved, which is not what I expected. I thought it was just going to be a direct CSS reference.
Yeah, this one also, at least from the beginning, kind of looks like it's just custom in that getter.
Share so we're not all there. Just so we're on the same page as what it is I'm looking at. Cassandra, if you want to feel physically ill, look at this. Yeah.
Good times.
Colors map. Let's just spread and put. Who needs SAS when we can just do it live? That's an interest. I have not seen that approach used.
Yeah. Yeah, so it seems like there's kind of like this part of the world seems like a questionable thing, which is like we haven't quite figured out the best way to take existing frameworks and meld them into the web components world. It's basically greenfield from the bottom up, and we're essentially pushing our styles out to the host versus having the host pull them in.
Yeah, we run into this with so Patternfly has a CSS file that styles all of their components based on HTML. We're kind of starting out new web components, building things. We've been building things, like you say, greenfield, but we really wanted to bring in existing styles. But the problem is they've applied all of these styles to classes, and these classes don't really fit well in the web component because it's like, well, that's a slot and that's nested and that's in the shadow DOM, and so I need to put this attribute and this attribute, and so we're kind of having to rethink both approaches and create. What we're doing is having the Patternfly project create extends, which we can then in the mono repo of our project pull in their stuff as a dependency and then extend those styles in sets where we need to, and then they would just apply those extends to their classes. Not the best solution, and it requires that you be on really good terms with the people who own the project that you want to extend.
Yep. Yeah, I just philosophically thinking about this over the last couple hours, I was thinking it would be amazing. It's essentially a Babel plugin, though. If the component could just figure out the classes that I'm using and then go rip them out of Tailwind and just shove them into the styles as a Babel plugin, that sort of solves the problem, at least getting them in there. And it's a compile time issue, not a actual dealing with it as far as manually entering the styles. But that's my 30 second
figure it
gist.
out at an import level. With using that import CSS, we can have that be going there and not have to rely on things like Babel. So anytime I hear Babel or transpilation, it really freaks me out.
So you were saying you think how was it you recommended?
I have no intelligent way of saying how I hope this will work.
Oh.
At all. I'm in the same position as well, and it is that this is greenfield. But I just expect and hope that there will be a way to kind of we have ES module import loading with JavaScript, that there will be something like that with CSS loading, where you can just specify with a CSS variable which of the set of options you want to be importing CSS from, and it'll go out and grab it that way.
I swear I've seen. So I agree. That's definitely gonna be the path forward, because that's my hope with there's the import spec has modular HTML, modular CSS, and modular JSON all as proposals, which you get modular JSON, and then I'm just killing all my Ajax and fetch calls and things. But I swear I've seen things that use the unsafe CSS lit element capability to go and fetch your CSS file and then just treat it like it's unsafe CSS and inject it into the CSS.
Yeah, that was my first approach, and I tried that, except for that only works if you're not then using these kind of libraries like Tailwind or something like that then does the imports. If you end up with a for instance, the very first thing I have at the top of one of my CSS files is an import to Google Fonts. So it doesn't pull that into a raw CSS file. So then because it has imports, it can't use ultimately the CSS DOM to do that replace sync. So you end up in the same position as you would if you weren't doing it that way.
So in our Kludge way as well, I agree with you. This is certainly an area where greenfields versus old things. Let me show it. So the simple colors thing I showed, that is like our, hey, we have this wonderful thing where we've never built an application before. However, when we actually use this in when we use our stuff in Hack CMS, yes, we're in that scenario where we're building the entire universe so we can have total control. But when we get into, like, this is one of our production applications, and Mike and I have talked about this before, of any, you mentioned breaking the shadow root. We will break the shadow root on anything that goes into the production app to get at what we consider like the content or main area. So I don't know if that helps at all, but if you, in that case, like our video player, which we would consider like green fields, this has a very specific way of looking. It's not going to matter what environment's dropped into, that shadow root. The full application layer, which is like this little click and jump to different pages thing, that is ultimately all light DOM, as you can see with this MOOC content element, which is light DOM all the way through, and then just has all this stuff in its inner area.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so it's not a, you're saying sometimes not using the shadow root is okay. It's not like a taboo thing.
Oh no, we break those all the time. I think it's more of like, know why you're doing it.
Yep.
And then if you're Cassandra, you're laughing because you're like, haha, you people and your shadow roots.
We can do both. You act like we don't use any. We use
I know.
shadow root.
That's fair. All right. Yeah, I was getting the impression that that if you were doing the create render root, that you were you needed slapped every time you did that. But it also solved the problem in a pinch. So I was like, well, we're doing it that way.
I think you just need to know
I default to
why.
light DOM whenever I can.
Okay.
As well.
Good to know. Thank you.
This was an awesome discussion. I love that Tom is going to cut this whole thing. We've got this whole continuity of people talking about this.